Just before her death, Nancy Rooks, the woman who spent a decade working inside Graceland and served Elvis Presley his midnight meals, whispered a sentence that sent shockwaves through the fandom. It's time to tell everything. For over 45 years, she had protected the king's legacy with unwavering loyalty. She never gave scandalous interviews, never cashed in on secrets, never contradicted the official story. But in her final months, something changed. Close friends say Nancy grew more reflective, even burdened. And when she finally chose to speak, what she revealed wasn't the warm tribute fans expected. It was a quiet confession that suggested the truth about Elvis's final hours may have been far more tragic and far more preventable than anyone ever imagined. This is the story behind that confession, and why her words, spoken decades too late, have forced fans and historians alike to reconsider what really happened behind the closed doors of Graceland. Long before she became the center of a late-breaking controversy, Nancy Rooks was simply known as the woman who kept Graceland running. Hired in 1967 as a maid and cook, Nancy didn't come to Elvis Presley's world through stardom or spotlight. She entered quietly, apron on, ready to scrub dishes and fry bacon. But within months, her role evolved into something much deeper. She became a constant presence in the Presley household, someone who saw Elvis not as a myth, but as a man who wandered the halls barefoot at night, humming gospel songs or asking for sweet potato pie at 3 a.m. Unlike many who surrounded the king, Nancy never sought fame. Even after Elvis's death in 1977, she remained loyal, working for the Presley family as Graceland transitioned into a public museum. And while fans swarmed the mansion gates to mourn and celebrate their idol, Nancy stayed in the shadows, tending to Elvis's private quarters, wiping dust from furniture no one else was allowed to touch. In 1995, she published a gentle memoir titled Inside Graceland, Elvis's Maid Remembers, a book filled with fond anecdotes, polite observations, and carefully chosen memories. There was no scandal, no accusations, only admiration. And that's what made her final confession decades later so stunning. Because when a woman who refused to speak badly of Elvis for 45 years suddenly said, "It's time to tell everything," people listened. To understand the weight of those words, we have to go back. Back to the quiet loyalty she carried. Back to the nights she folded his clothes. Back to the job that made her a witness to one of music's most tragic unravelings. Nancy Rooks didn't seek the spotlight, but she was there, every step of the way. Life inside Graceland was unlike anything most people could imagine, especially for those tasked with keeping it running. For Nancy Rooks, it wasn't just a job. It was an immersion into Elvis Presley's unpredictable rhythm. She worked not by the clock, but by his schedule, often staying up until the early morning hours just in case Mr. Elvis, as she always called him, wanted biscuits, bacon, or his favorite sweet potato pie. Graceland, to the outside world, was a mansion filled with opulence and music. But to Nancy, it was a living maze of moods. One day might bring spontaneous gospel sing-alongs in the kitchen, Elvis belting, "How Great Thou Art," while she wiped down the counters. The next, she might find herself tiptoeing through quiet hallways while Elvis paced in silence, lost in thought at 2 a.m., avoiding everyone. He was always polite, always gracious. Please and thank you never left his vocabulary. No matter how chaotic the household became. But Nancy witnessed something the public never did. How fame didn't always bring peace. She saw Elvis retreat into solitude, shut himself in his room for hours, or stare through windows like he was looking for something he couldn't quite name. He was restless, a man at odds with his legend. And through it all, Nancy was there. Not just making beds or frying bacon. She was adjusting pool furniture, helping him with his clothes, even hemming his pants while he still had them on. She once said, "He was famous to the world, but to me, he was just Mr. Elvis." That simple statement carried weight, because it meant she saw what others didn't. She saw the joy, the charm, but also the exhaustion, the fragility. She became not just a worker, but a witness to the human behind the icon. And it was this first-hand view, years of subtle changes, and unspoken tension that would later shape the unease Nancy carried in her final days. August 16th, 1977, began like so many others inside Graceland. Quiet, humid, and cloaked in the kind of stillness that always seemed to linger in the early hours. Elvis had been up late again, this time playing racquetball with his fiancée, Ginger Alden, and cousin Billy Smith. It was the sort of late-night burst of energy he was known for. But when he returned home, Nancy Rooks was already in the kitchen, apron on, preparing breakfast just in case. She offered him something to eat, but Elvis shook his head. "No, I don't want anything now," he said. "I just want to get some sleep, but I would like some water." What happened next seemed ordinary at the time. Nancy asked another,
made Pauline to take a jug of water upstairs. It was a simple, handled container like the kind orange juice came in, but what Pauline noticed was unsettling. Elvis didn't sip the water. He gulped it down, fast, almost desperate. "I ain't never know him to grab that water and drink it like he drank it this morning," she would say later. Nancy brushed it off. Maybe he was just tired from racquetball. The house fell quiet again. Then, at around 9:30 a.m., Nancy heard a sound, a dull thump from upstairs. Not loud, not alarming, but enough to make her pause. She waited. No voices, no footsteps, no signs of trouble. Just silence, the kind of silence you talk yourself out of worrying about. She returned to her chores. Hours passed. Then, at 1:50 p.m., the intercom buzzed. Ginger Alden's voice came through, shaky and panicked. "Who's down there? Something bad has happened up here." Nancy's blood went cold. She didn't wait. She ran up the stairs, her heart pounding, with every step. At the end of the hall, she turned into the dressing room. And there, on the bathroom floor, lay Elvis Presley, face down, unmoving. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is this?" But she didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She acted. Nancy raced back downstairs and alerted the men of the Memphis Mafia. The moments that followed were chaos. But as panicked voices filled the house, it was Nancy who calmly led the paramedics up the stairs, showing them how to lift the stretcher over tight stairwells and maneuver through narrow corners. When they brought Elvis down, Nancy saw him one final time. He looked just like he was asleep, she later said. But something else haunted her. Blue spots on his face, a detail the world wouldn't hear for years. The official story would say cardiac arrest. But for Nancy, something about that morning, something in his voice, in that water, in the silence after the thump, never quite left her. In the whirlwind of confusion that followed Elvis Presley's collapse, a single moment would come to define the burden Nancy Rooks carried for the rest of her life. It happened in the narrow window between the discovery of Elvis's body and the arrival of emergency responders. Nancy had done what she always did, acted quickly, quietly, and without question, but this time, her instincts might have led her straight into a cover-up she never intended. According to people close to her, in the minutes after she alerted the Memphis Mafia, someone, she never said who, told her to straighten things up in the bathroom. It didn't sound sinister at the time. Nancy wiped down a counter, folded a towel, maybe moved a few bottles. Nothing drastic, nothing that, to her, would have seemed unusual after a lifetime of tidying up Graceland's every corner. But in hindsight, it felt different. Years later, rumors began to surface, unconfirmed, whispered, but persistent. Multiple sources claimed that pill bottles were missing when police arrived. Some alleged that Elvis's cousin, Joe Esposito, was involved in removing them. Others pointed fingers at members of the entourage, but Nancy never named names. She never accused anyone outright. What she did say, quietly, painfully, and only in trusted company, was this: "I didn't know what I was covering up. I just did what I was told." This single sentence reignited long-standing questions about the official cause of death. Yes, the autopsy listed cardiac arrest, but the toxicology report, according to multiple investigations, underwent revisions. And, despite public demand, the Presley estate has never released the full, unredacted findings. Add to that the 2-hour delay between Elvis's collapse and the emergency call, and the timeline becomes murky, almost too murky for comfort. For Nancy, the damage wasn't physical, it was emotional. In her final years, she reportedly replayed that morning over and over. The jug of water, the thump, the silence, the request to clean. What seemed like a harmless act of loyalty at the time slowly transformed into a source of regret. And while she never claimed to have hidden a crime, she began to wonder if her obedience had unintentionally helped conceal the truth. Her voice, once steady in devotion, began to tremble with uncertainty. What had she done? And more importantly, what had she missed? For over 4 decades after Elvis Presley's death, Nancy Rooks remained a quiet guardian of his memory. She continued working for the Presley family, helping convert Graceland from a private mansion into a public museum. Tourists came and went, snapping photos and leaving flowers at the gates. But upstairs, where Elvis had lived, laughed, and ultimately died, remained closed to all. And Nancy? She was one of the few people ever allowed back in. She would return to those upstairs rooms, once or twice a month to clean. No lingering, no questions, no commentary, just a silent routine, dusting furniture, folding shirts, wiping the same bathroom counter where she had once seen him lying face down. Every time she stepped into that space, the memories returned, not in dramatic flashes, but in quiet, unbearable pieces. And yet, she told no one. When her memoir Inside Graceland was released in the 1990s, Readers expected revelations, but instead they found warmth, nostalgia, and fond memories of Elvis's eating habits, music preferences, and gentle nature. There were no hints of the chaos, no detailed recollection of that August morning, and certainly no mention of anything suspicious. She painted a portrait of the king that fans wanted, golden, unblemished, and untouched by tragedy. But privately, Nancy wasn't so certain anymore. In small interviews, she began dropping cryptic hints. Once, she reportedly said, "If people knew what I know, they'd never hear his music the same again." Not a threat, not a scandal, just a statement, one filled with the kind of pain that only silence can cultivate. Why didn't she speak sooner? Those close to her say it wasn't fear, it was reverence. In Memphis, Elvis wasn't just a musician, he was sacred. To publicly question his final hours was to invite backlash not only from fans, but from an entire city that had built its identity around his legend. Nancy had seen grown men weep at his grave. She'd watched women travel across oceans just to stand at the gate. She understood that devotion, and maybe that's why she swallowed her doubts for so long. But the weight of what she knew never left her. It lingered behind her eyes in interviews, in the pauses during conversations, in the way she'd changed the subject when the timeline of that morning was brought up. She never lied. She just chose not to tell. Until, near the end, she couldn't hold it in anymore. In the final year of her life, something shifted in Nancy Rooks. Friends noticed it first. Not in her health, but in her tone. She became more direct, more reflective. The woman who had spent decades carefully guarding Elvis Presley's memory began to speak with a quiet urgency, as if time was finally running out, not just for her, but for the truth. And then, one day, she said the words that no one ever expected to hear, "It's time to tell everything." She didn't gather reporters or organize a public confession. That wasn't her style. But to those closest to her, Nancy began to reveal pieces of the story she had carried alone for nearly 45 years. According to one longtime friend, she confessed that Elvis hadn't been well for weeks before his death, far worse than the public ever knew. She said he was exhausted, physically and emotionally. He was tired of the medicine, she reportedly whispered. Tired of pretending. She told them about the bottles, new prescriptions showing up constantly, some allegedly not even prescribed for Elvis, bottles disappearing into the trash before anyone asked questions. She remembered seeing him doze off mid-sentence, mid-meal, sometimes mid-conversation. The time, she thought it was just exhaustion. But in hindsight, she feared it was something far more dangerous, a slow fade the people around him either couldn't see or refused to stop. And then came the hardest part. Nancy finally opened up about what happened just after Elvis was found on the bathroom floor. Ginger Alden had made the panicked call downstairs. Nancy had rushed up the stairs, heart racing. She saw him lying there, face down, unresponsive. Instinct took over. She turned back, ran to alert the others, but before the ambulance arrived, someone, still unnamed to this day, asked her to tidy up. So she did. She straightened a few items, wiped a surface, moved what she later realized could have been evidence. "I didn't know what I was covering up," she said. "I just did what I was told." For years, she pushed that memory to the back of her mind, but in her final months, she couldn't escape it. The memory of the ice water Elvis drank too, quickly. The quiet thump she heard upstairs, the silence that followed, the small obedient acts that may have softened the scene before the authorities ever saw it. And then came the line, the one that would reframe everything. Elvis didn't just die, he faded, and no one stopped it. That single sentence wasn't just an admission. It was a quiet, devastating shift in how Nancy saw her own role in history. And it was the moment the world began to see her not just as a maid, but as the final witness to a man and a legacy slowly unraveling. When news of Nancy Rooks's final confession began to circulate, quietly at first, then with mounting momentum, the reaction from Elvis Presley's fans and historians was far from unanimous. It wasn't a tabloid expose, not a shocking tell-all, sold to the highest bidder. Instead, it was a whisper, one passed between friends, colleagues, and eventually journalists that cracked open a decades-old narrative so many believed was settled. And as the details emerged, the Elvis world was suddenly divided. Some dismissed it instantly. They clung to her memoir, Inside Graceland, as the final word, a clean, reverent portrait of a man beloved by millions. To them, the idea that the very same woman was now implying a mishandled scene or hinting at suppressed truths felt unthinkable. Others were angry, not at Nancy, but at what her words suggested, that Elvis's death may have involved more than just a failing heart, that there may have been warning signs ignored, or worse, evidence tampered with. Online forums lit up with debate. Longtime Presley biographers began revisiting the timeline, Why had it taken nearly 4 hours to call for help? Why had the toxicology report gone through so many redactions before reaching the public? Who exactly was in the house that morning? And what did they do before the paramedics arrived? Videos analyzing Nancy's final words racked up millions of views. Hashtags like #Justice for Elvis and the Graceland Truth trended for days. Meanwhile, the Presley estate remained silent. There were no official statements, no acknowledgements of Nancy's claims. Graceland tours continued. Merchandise sales didn't falter. The Elvis brand, still a multi-million-dollar operation, stayed on script. But behind the scenes, staff who had worked with Nancy, those who remembered her quiet dignity, began to murmur. They said the energy at Graceland had shifted. To some, Nancy's confession was a betrayal. To others, it was bravery. But almost everyone agreed on one point. Her words reopened wounds that never fully healed. Not just because they suggested Elvis's final hours were mishandled, but because they challenged the way we choose to remember legends. Her admission didn't accuse. It didn't name names. But it did what all great truths eventually do. It made people uncomfortable. And in the world of celebrity legacies, where myth often triumphs over reality, that discomfort was long overdue. In the aftermath of Nancy Rooks' quiet confession, one thing became clear. The story of Elvis Presley could no longer be told the same way. For decades, he had been immortalized as the king of rock and roll, a near mythical figure whose larger-than-life presence overshadowed his human flaws. But Nancy's final words didn't diminish him, they humanized him. And in doing so, they forced a painful but necessary re-examination of what his legacy truly means. Because what Nancy described wasn't a man who collapsed in a blaze of glory. It was a man who faded slowly, painfully, and in silence. A man who, despite having an army of people around him, may have been failed by the very circle meant to protect him. Her confession reframed the narrative. No longer was this just a story of a rock icon lost to fate. It was the story of a deeply isolated individual, worn down by pressure, dulled by medication, and trapped inside a mansion that often felt more like a prison. And perhaps most hauntingly, it was the story of people who noticed things but didn't speak up. People who dismissed warning signs as quirks. People who asked for towels to be folded while the truth lay bleeding just feet away. Nancy's decision to stay silent for so long was rooted in loyalty. But in the end, she questioned whether that loyalty had protected Elvis or protected those who enabled his decline. Her final statement, Elvis didn't just die, he faded, and no one stopped it, wasn't just a haunting recollection. It was a verdict, a subtle, devastating reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't a sudden fall. It's the slow, preventable unraveling no one wants to admit. And so the legend of Elvis remains, but with a new layer. One that doesn't erase his greatness, but dares to ask, what if the man behind the myth had been truly seen, truly helped, and truly saved? Would the king still have faded quietly behind closed doors? Or would the ending have been different if only someone had spoken up in time? Nancy Rooks never sought headlines. She didn't chase cameras, write exposés, or turn her years inside Graceland into a stage. But in the end, it was her voice, soft, measured, and decades in the making, that pierced through the noise. Her confession didn't come wrapped in scandal. It came wrapped in sorrow, and it left behind not just questions about Elvis Presley's final hours, but about the price of silence, loyalty, and legacy. She had folded his shirts, served his midnight snacks, cleaned the very floor where the king's reign came to an end. And after 45 years of protecting the man she called Mr. Elvis, she finally said the one thing that changed everything. It's time to tell everything. Now, the question belongs to us. Did Nancy Rooks wait too long to speak up? Or was her final whisper the only way she knew how to truly honor the man she never stopped protecting? If this story made you see Elvis in a different light, more human, more vulnerable, then share it. Because behind every icon is a truth that deserves to be heard. Subscribe for more untold stories and hidden legacies. Comment your thoughts. Was Nancy's silence loyalty or guilt? Like the video if you believe truth should never expire. And don't miss our next deep dive, where another insider from Graceland steps out of the shadows. Because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that changes history. It's the quiet one that finally speaks.